fact, I should totally add this one to our page. Maybe I will. So I don't know how to say this name. MNIH. We'll just pretend I pronounced it. He took a bunch of Atari games and he wrote a neural network that would control the player to play these games. And is this the one I wanted? Nope. There's a slightly better one. That's the one. No, I was just looking for I was actually just going to use one of his figures as one of my slides since I didn't make any slides. That's the one I wanted. So he's feeding images. These are just screenshots from his video games as input. These days, because convolutional layers are really, really good at processing images, using big images as input to a neural net is commonplace. Everybody's doing it. So images go in, convolutional layer, and what comes out is these are all the controls on an Atari 2600 joystick with button. All the possible things you could do are go up, go diagonal up, go right, go down, and then all those same actions with the button being pushed. Well, there's an approach called Q-learning, which is actually just, the only difference is a change of the target function. So instead of targeting, if you're in a video game, what action do you do? We don't actually know what action is best. So what we do is we let the action that's best depend on the next action we do, which depends on the next action we do, and it cascades off infinitely. Well, Q-learning provides a way for us to write a target function that eventually converges to what we want the target function to be. Does that make any sense? Well, essentially, it means that if we use the Q-learning equation here as our target, then our neural network will learn to control the system in a way that eventually is provably optimal. And that's really cool. So images go in, neural network crunches a bunch of numbers, control paddle goes out. And now we know how to drive the Atari 2600 game. Well, what's cool about this is this is how well his neural network did at playing these games. And you see this line right here? This is the line at how good humans are. Meaning everything below this, humans can do better than his neural network-based controller. Everything above it, and admittedly, these are some of the dumber Atari 2600 games, like Pinball and Breakout. But nevertheless, based only on images and crazy amounts of training, the neural network has learned to outperform humans at a large number of games. And this is not a separate neural network trained on each of these games. This is one neural network that is trained, no, that's not true, but it's one algorithm, meaning he didn't rewrite separate code for each game. He wrote a general purpose, images go in, controls go out, and it learns to play any of these games. Essentially, this is kind of general AI, isn't it? I mean, it's an AI that can generalize across Atari 2600 games. It can't fold your laundry or contemplate the justness of democracy or anything like that. But it can learn to play a random Atari 2600 game that you give it. Or even games that aren't Atari 2600, as long as the input is an image and the output is the controls plus or minus a button. So that's really cool, and it beat humans in a lot of cases.
Are those scored like average people or high scores?
You know, I'd have to really read the paper to know. I don't know. And here he is visualizing a low-dimensional projection of his internal model space. It's kind of a new cool thing to do because it makes crazy, weird pictures that people get to look at and say, whoa, that's deep, man. Really deep. And it looks like a brain, doesn't it? It has nothing to do with a brain, but it looks like one, therefore it must be intelligent. Okay. Yeah. So, here's the model for Q-learning. This is a neural network. Observations go in. Controls go out. I guess I was using U for controls and X for observations if we try to be consistent with our assignment 6 notation. The problem with this particular model is that the controls have to be discrete. Otherwise, you can't assign a utility value to each of the possible controls. So an objective that we might want to have is to say, how can we train a robot that has, say, continuous range of motion? Maybe you can apply certain forces to all of the joints in a robot. And we'd like to use Q-learning to learn to control this articulated robot so that it can operate in a complex space and do really useful things like fold our laundry or wash our dishes or walk our dog. Don't we all want a household robot? I mean, Jetsons, right? I may not care. I don't want a flying car. I want a robot that's going to cook me dinner and wash the dishes. Everybody looks at the flying car as the symbol of the future. I don't know why. Who cares about stupid flying cars? It's Rosie the robot is what it's all about, I'm telling you. I mean, yeah, I want a self-driving car and a Rosie the robot. I don't care whether I go through the sky. Well, here's how they've finally accomplished it. If you take X and you feed this in as the state, you could say that based on the state, we're going to predict our controls, where U represents controls. Okay? Well, based on our state and our controls, if we're in this state and we do this action, then that's going to lead us to some utility score, which I'll represent with Z, where Z is the goodness of performing this action in that state. And then I'm going to use the Q-learning technique. So this letter Q right there represents that I've applied Q-learning, which I admit I haven't taught in this class, so you don't really know what I'm talking about. But if you take my advanced AI class, you will. If we use the Q-learning equation to turn this into an error signal, we can train this model that predicts how good doing this action is in that state. Well, because of the way backpropagation works, we can take an error signal that's been propagated across that model and propagate it into this model. This one we call the actor because it's, given what state we're in, it chooses what action we should perform. This one has been called the critic because given what we do in each state, it tells us the utility of that thing we did or how good or bad it is. And what we've effectively done is we've taken a complex system controlling a robot in a hard space and reduced it into two simpler problems. One problem is, what should we do in every state? And the other problem is, how good was that? Okay? By simply simplifying the problem, and because neural networks backpropagate into each other, they can specialize and solve these problems, and we're starting to get to systems now that divide up the problems. Okay. Now the next point I want to make is this. Now we've looked at a bunch of different systems. Okay. Here are a whole bunch of models, several of which we have studied. We spent the first half of this semester, more than that, first 2/3 of this semester studying function approximation. This is basically supervised learning, right? X goes in, Y comes out, we train our model until we fit that. Recently, I've started talking more about autoencoders. Autoencoders take some observation and they encode it. and then decode it to produce the same observation. See how it makes kind of a cycle here? Basically, that's what an autoencoder does. It encodes and decodes and tries to produce the same thing and trains its models until it can do that while passing through a bottleneck. And I claim this is very useful because low-dimensional representations of state are what enable things to generalize. They're what cause the digestion of information, right? It's the, what's the word I'm looking for? It starts with a D, and it's not dissolve or dissolute. Disseminate, there's a word that starts with D that would be really good to use right now for reducing state into some small representation. I swear it starts with a D.
Discretize?
It's not discretize.
Yeah.
Digest. Digest is a good one. It's almost digest. I'll just be content with that one right now. It's what you do with alcohol when you're trying to distill. Yeah. You know what? Digest is actually better. Oh well. You can distill your state into some internal representation that's more meaningful, that's more potent, that's more alcoholic, and gets you drunker. Whoa, hey, there's an exciting part in the video. Okay, and I talked briefly about the actor-critic model, right? This breaks down the problem of controlling a robot or some other system into what should you do and how good was that. We know all about recurrent neural nets. You did this in assignment 6. They're great for time series prediction. You can transition through states. I talked about GANs, right? We have the generator and the discriminator. This one actually produces images. This one determines which ones are real and which ones are fake. And we pit them against each other. Okay. Do you get this slide? This slide is saying, hey, look, if we look at the trends in deep learning these days, this is what we see is lots of little models that are starting to use multiple models that fit together to do various important tasks that are part of cognition. And as we look at them, I've used common letters here for common things. So I've used the letter V to represent state. And you see how I used a V inside the autoencoder because that's kind of state. It's a reduced dimensional version of the observation. And I have a state here in the actor-critic model because it's state that we use to, it's in this state that you perform that action. I've consistently used U for controls and so forth. But here's kind of the grand observation as I move forward through this slide is there's a lot of commonality among these things, right? There's a state in this model and that model and that model. There's an observation in these models. There's controls in those models. Doesn't that imply that these models all kind of, if you bend them around and fit them together right, somehow they start to plug into each other and form something grander and more complete than each of those individual task solvers? Okay. Well, this takes us to the domain of cognitive architectures. Here is a picture of a cognitive architecture that I designed. And this has a whole bunch of different parts, and they do different things, and they plug into each other, and all of that. I published a paper on it, and some people read it, and a few people said, whoa, that's deep, man, and a few other people said, that's stupid, and that's what always happens when you publish a paper. But I have some arguments for why this architecture makes a lot of sense. But I'm not trying to sell you on my architecture. What I'm trying to point out right now is, to a very strong extent, this is where I think the domain of machine learning is going, is we're starting to fit our pieces together and plug them into each other and figure out how we can factor learning back from each of the other parts such that this whole thing forms an agent that can actually operate in some world and can learn from its observations and figure out what to do. And if we could solve this thing, well, then we will have finally succeeded at the ultimate grand challenge. We will achieve parity with human brains, which we know are darn good learning machines, in machines that we actually understand. Okay. So here I compare it to a human brain, and here's something that I think is really cool. If we look at my cognitive architecture, wink. So there was, you know what, I can't really explain that without showing you the paper. I added another paper to our list of potential readings for reading 3. And this one I think I actually read in my advanced AI class, so some of you might have seen it before. What are the computations of the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, and the cerebral cortex? This is a neuroscience paper. It doesn't have a lot to do with machine learning. Well, that's not true at all. It has a lot to do with machine learning. But here's what they have found, is by studying the brain, it looks like the cerebral cortex does unsupervised learning. It looks like the cerebellum does supervised learning, and it looks like the basal ganglia does reinforcement learning. How interesting that we would find in biology the very same components that seem to have evolved into discrete areas of study in science, isn't it? Okay, so that's where I get back to this slide here. I didn't actually know that. I found this paper after I designed this cognitive architecture, but I thought I was getting all cool because after I started fitting the pieces together the way they seemed to naturally fit together, I noticed that I had utilized the 3 major components of learning that occur in computer science, which are supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. And one of my reviewers pointed out to me, hey, you should cite this paper. And I went and read the paper, and it says that, hey, look, the brain does each of those similar things, and that just seemed really cool to me. So I wanted to point that out to my class, that it looks like these cognitive architectures are starting to follow some of the same patterns that occur in the brain. That's not necessarily totally true, but to the extent that it is true, you know, maybe we're starting to engineer from the bottom up some of the same things we're finding as we reverse engineer the brain from the top down. If we can just get those 2 bridges to meet, darn it, won't cool things happen, right? So there are entire conferences now dedicated to cognitive architectures, and people will debate over why their model for feelings and emotions are more realistic than the other models for feelings and emotions. And half of it is a lot of scientists trying to define the objective, because nobody really knows why we're building cognitive architectures. They just sort of seem to be forming from all the pieces of what's going on in machine learning. So different researchers will say they have different objectives. But cognitive computing is kind of the next buzzword that seems to be taking hold in my observations. And so I think we're going to really start seeing AI producing a lot of things that mirror brain-like functionalities. And I think that's kind of cool. Okay, so if you want to read that paper too, go ahead. There it is. It's a little heavy on the neuroscience stuff. You know, you might not want to spend all of your time trying to penetrate it, but I should also say some more things about some of these other papers. Alas, I'm out of time, so I guess I'll end today's lecture there. Thanks for coming, and see you next time.